I'm delighted today to be joined by Yoram Hazony. He's an Israeli philosopher, a Bible scholar, and a conservative commentator and political theorist, and author most recently of Conservatism, a Rediscovery, and a couple of years ago, he also came out with The Virtue of Nationalism, two books which caused quite a storm in the conservative media space, and I'm going to speak to him about both of them today. Yoram, thank you for joining me.
You're very welcome. Before we begin, I should just mention that there is going to be a UK edition of the new book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery. It's already available for pre-order on Amazon UK, and will shortly be available everywhere.
Good. Well, we'll keep our eyes peeled for that. When is the release date?
August 25th.
Exciting stuff. Great. Well, in your latest book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, you argue that only a return to conservatism can save us from the deadly waltz between liberalism and woke neo-Marxism. Why do you think liberals and woke neo-Marxists make such great dance partners? Surely the classical liberal belief in freedom of speech, equality of opportunity, and individual liberty should make them sworn enemies.
They're not always sworn enemies, but at times they are. I think to understand the relationship, you need to go back to the early early thinkers of liberalism, Enlightenment rationalists like Hobbes and Locke, and the Rousseau of the Rousseau of the Social Contract, and Kant, Spinoza. What all of these thinkers have in common, aside from the general structure of a social contract theory of the way government is formed, and the belief in the natural perfect equality and liberty of all individuals. Aside from that, they have a third thing that all of these thinkers had in common, which is the belief in rationalism. Rationalism is an academic name for a theory of knowledge, and this theory of knowledge assumes that if you encourage people to think freely, to reason according to their own powers without any kind of constraints, that they will attain agreement on the true nature of most things, like, for example, the true nature of the best political regime, the true nature of the best moral system, the truth about religion. Reason is, according to all of these thinkers, supposed to quickly bring some kind of consensus and agreement about all of these huge issues which for thousands of years human beings have argued about. And the result is that when an Enlightenment liberalism becomes, after the Second World War, becomes kind of the almost the sole legitimate public philosophy, public religion of American Britain and other Western countries, what's incorporated into that is this rationalist belief that all we need to do is allow people to debate freely, to have academic freedom, to have freedom of the press, to have freedom to express themselves, and that would naturally lead not only to truth, but to a kind of a convergence where everyone would come to agree, everyone except a few primitives would come to agree about the basics on politics and religion and other matters. And the result is that when you're in the classroom, and this can be true in elementary school, high school, certainly in university, when you're in the classroom with one of these Enlightenment liberals, they're assuming that all they need to do is ask you, what do you think? What do you think about abortion? What do you think about religion? What do you think about God? What do you think? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't ask young students what they think, but it seems empirically that what happens is when you're always asking people what they think, then they start thinking. And it turns out that not all of them think in a liberal direction. And in fact, if we look at the trajectory of academic thought over the last few generations, what we see is that extremely very, very smart people use their academic freedom. They reason very well, the best of them, and they come out with Marxist conclusions. And they come out, some of them also come up with conservative conclusions and fascist conclusions. But the great movement that we've seen is raise kids to think independently, to think for themselves, and a very large number of them are going to think that the Marxists sound more reasonable than the liberals.
And so conservatism has an advantage over liberalism because it does articulate a core set of fundamental values upon which your thinking should be predicated, rather than just thinking in the liberal vacuum. Is that the reason why you think a rediscovery of conservatism is needed here, rather than a rediscovery of classical liberalism?
Yes, I think when we're talking about, look, when we talk about liberalism, you can call it classical liberalism or libertarianism. That there's all sorts of names for it. But when we're talking about this traditional form of liberalism, we're basically talking about people who start from the premise that if you have individual liberty and if you have individual equality, liberty, and individual liberty and equality, that's basically the foundation that you need in order to know how government and society should be run. And when you're talking about conservatives, you're talking about a different school of thought. Conservatives, certainly in Britain and America, value individual liberty, but conservatives begin from a different place. The conservative asks, what is it that we need to do in order for our nation, for our people, to be able to flourish and hand down its traditions and to continue to identify itself, to grow and to gain strength over generations through time. So a conservative begins with a certain political group to which he or she is loyal and is thinking about, and says, what do we need to do in order to strengthen this group and to maintain it over generations? And certainly individual liberties can be part of that answer, but many other things turn out to be part of that answer as well. So conservatism ends up being a much more sophisticated and realistic point of view than liberalism, and certainly a different one.
Interesting. Okay. So, and one of those things is the need for nationalism, in your view. Now, of course, nationalism can be a dirty word. However, you claim that it is integral to Anglo-American conservatism and define it not in belligerent terms, but as a political commitment to, quote, national collectives characterized by bonds of mutual loyalty and unique inherited traditions. That is very stirring language to me and anybody else proud of belonging to a particular territory. But do you ever fear that it may be too romantic and old-fashioned to grip most educated people in our hyper-globalized world?
Look, it's not the people who get into these discussions about whether it's good to have independent nations or not, they tend to have accepted from academia a belief that nationalism is some kind of a new thing that was invented at the end of the 18th century and used to brainwash people, and because it's a new thing, they assume that you can just get rid of it. And my view of the subject is really quite different. I believe that nations are natural, just as families are natural, tribes are natural, nations are natural. Human beings are sticky. They naturally form into tribal groups, an in-group and an out-group, a we, as Roger Scruton always used to say. And because it's natural for human beings to form these groups, we need to begin by assuming that there are going to be such groups, and then we need to ask what is the best way to govern ourselves, what is the best way to govern the world, if once you consider that human beings are loyal to different national groupings, and these national groupings, they will have their own language. They will often have their own religion. Even if they have the same religion, it'll be different. It'll be their own version of some religion. They have their own laws, traditional laws, They have their own history, and these things allow each nation to recognize themselves and to and also cause them to be willing to fight for one another. That reality is one that cannot be suppressed. I mean, you can try to suppress it. So think about the Soviet Union attempting to eliminate the nationalities in, you know, whether it was Poland or Armenia, the attempt to eliminate nationalities. Now Ukraine was a signal failure. The Soviets couldn't, and no amount of force and brutality could eliminate the attachment to nations, and the same is true everywhere else that it's been tried. So the nationalist view says that that the world is governed best when nations are when many nations are given the freedom, are allowed to govern themselves according to their own interests and their own traditions. And go ahead.
No, so it's not so much that nationalism needs to be argued for. It needs to be recognized as a pre-political fact, as it were, and the attempt to suppress it and to deny it is a fantasy.
The attempt to suppress or deny that there are nations, that they're natural, and that they're naturally cohesive and want to fight to improve their condition. That's something you can't deny. If you try to deny it, you get disastrous policies. Okay. But there are alternatives to nationalism. You can be an imperialist. You can say, look, I understand that nations are a natural thing, and that you can never get rid of the love of nation. Nevertheless, I think the world would be better off. There'd be fewer wars, and economic prosperity would reign if one nation conquered the whole rest of the world and then governed it. And there've been, since Roman times, since Babylonian times, there've been plenty of theories saying that if you create this gigantic worldwide EU, European Union type of thing, then peace and prosperity will reign. And a nationalist will say, well, that never really works, does it? I mean, you can apply immense force and suppress people, but what you cannot do is you cannot give them any kind of right to vote, any kind of control over their own lives, either as individuals or as nations. So we see that empires are never democratic. And if you believe in the kinds of freedoms that were developed in England and Britain, in America, for example, then you are going to have to be a nationalist.
How should conservative nationalists rise to the argument that there are global problems which require global forms of unity and allegiance?
Well, the first thing to notice is that global unity or allegiance is, whenever people talk like that, they create institutions that they're supposedly express this global unity and allegiance. And those institutions always look more or less like the United Nations, or take the World Health Organization, for example. That is, instead of eliminating national loyalties and creating a kind of an institution filled with selfless people who don't care at all about their own national background. Instead of that, what happens is that those nations that are thinking of their own interest, whether it's the Chinese or the Iranians or the Arab world or the Russians, whatever nations are left thinking about their own interests, quickly take over these institutions and use them in order to get whatever is good, whatever is good for their people. Now, that might not be so terrible if these institutions are not given much authority or control. But when we talk about world government, a worldwide empire speaking for all of mankind, what we're describing is something that will have a monopoly of force, and it will probably be controlled by the Chinese, just like the World Health Organization is controlled by the Chinese. And if you don't want it to be controlled by the Chinese, then you're going to have to fight to prevent it from being controlled by the Chinese, and you're back where you started from.
I see.
So that I think there simply is no such solution to our problems.
Now, this question takes some setting up because our viewers may not be familiar with it, but it struck me as important. In a recent article for Compact magazine, your friend Sohrab Emari conducted a critique of what he called liberal nationalism. He argued that liberalism and nationalism arose in tandem in the late 18th century, as you said earlier, and you said you contest that point. I happen to contest that point too, but for the moment, he said that liberalism and nationalism arose in tandem in the late 18th century as a dual challenge to the multinational empires underpinned by the moral authority of the Catholic Church. Amari's broader case was that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has revived this old relationship between liberalism and nationalism, as many Western liberals cloak themselves in the Ukrainian flag and deploy nationalistic language and rhetoric to justify liberal hawkishness. And Emari even criticized your nationalist conservative movement in particular for converging with, quote, the aims and interests of the transnational liberal institutions you claim to despise. Do you accept any part of that critique?
No.
Okay.
I think that my friend Sohrab has been reading Eric Hobsbawm and other Marxists over the last few months, and so he makes arguments that are built on the Marxist case for whatever he's trying to do at the moment, and the Hobsbawm historical argument is well known. We already touched on it. The Marxist view is that nationalism is a very recent ideology invented in order to serve the bourgeois, the liberals, and that story is well known. Marxists think that you need to oppose nationalism because it's standing in the because like liberalism, it's standing in the way of some kind of worldwide Marxist utopia. That's not the way conservatives understand the matter. Conservatives can easily see that for example, the movement for English independence from the Holy Roman Empire and from the popes in the 1500s, that movement was a form of nationalism, a version of nationalism. It was based on the English belief that England has its own common law tradition, its own language, its own version of the Christian religion, and that things would be best for the English if they were to be independent from control from Europe. By the way, this argument was already being made by Catholic Englishmen, centuries before Protestantism. So in the 1500s, it's linked to the creation of a Protestant Anglican church, but the English were making that argument for centuries before then, and so were other peoples in Europe, the Poles, the Hungarians. There's all sorts of peoples who made versions of this argument. I think a conservative will tend to read the Bible and recognize especially in the Old Testament, but some people argue also in the New Testament, certainly in the Old Testament, recognize the God of Hebrew Scripture as a God who thinks in terms of there being a world of many nations, yes, and who sets Israel on a course. He gives Israel on what today we would call a nationalist course. He gives Israel borders, and you could easily ask, well, if God, creator of heaven and earth, speaks the teaching to Moses, that's clearly a teaching meant for all of mankind, then why does Israel need borders? Why doesn't the God of Israel just send Moses out to conquer the entire world, just like the other gods of the Middle East, sent the Assyrians or the Babylonians? The answer is that that Hebrew scripture is on the side of independent nations. Moses is forbidden to, the Israelites are forbidden to try to conquer the neighboring peoples. They have their Torah, but their Torah is supposed to be implemented on their land and not implemented, kind of in this worldwide campaign to impose it on everyone else.
So you see, basically the point is that nationalism is of much more ancient and even biblical pedigree than people like Omari, and indeed, as you say, Eric Hobsbawm, who makes this argument in the first part of his tetralogy, I think, grants. Like, nationalism isn't something that begins with La Marseillaise in the late 18th century. It's a feeling that can be traced back into the distant past.
Yes, but it's more than a feeling. In scripture, it's a religious or philosophical standpoint. The claim that your nation should have a king of its own and prophets of its own, meaning that the people who rule you and teach you should be from your own people and not from some foreign people, and that you should have borders, and that those borders should not be crossed in order to try to impose your kings and your prophets on others. That is as far as we know, this appears for the first time in the Hebrew Bible, this worldview, this political theory, this ideology. And the West picks it up from there. And all through Western history, there's kind of this seesaw between the Roman inheritance, which does not recognize borders and independence days and independent nations, but just thinks, we should just conquer the whole world. That's the best idea. And the Jewish or Hebraic inheritance, which leads many European nations at different times to see themselves as like Israel, as an oppressed nation wanting independence. So if you look at the Dutch and the Dutch rebellion against the Spanish, you see the same thing, and you see the same thing among the Poles and others. So I would say the conservative view, there are professors who understand this. Adrian Hastings was a British scholar who wrote a book called The Construction of Nationhood, which argued that wherever the Bible is translated into the vernacular, it teaches nationalism. It teaches a love of national freedom and national independence.
What about, we'll get off Omari in a minute, but what about his what about his secondary claim that we're witnessing a convergence between your conservative nationalist project and the project of liberal internationalism at the moment since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that's a symbiosis that we should be suspicious of, I guess? What do you make?
I don't see any. I do not see any convergence. Okay. The liberal internationalists who are supporting Ukraine are supporting it because they claim that it is the cutting edge of liberal internationalism. Yes. Their argument is that everywhere in the world where they choose a people to fund, those people then turn into the cutting edge of liberal internationalism, and a useful tool in the effort to try to submerge the entire world under worldwide rule of law and liberalism. So that's them. Yes. And then there's us. There's national conservatives. Our view is completely different. It's quite distinct. We do have a sympathy for nations that are attempting to secure their own independence, and many of us are quite sympathetic to Ukraine for that reason. But Omari's argument is not. He doesn't actually believe what he's saying. It's simply propaganda being deployed against what he sees as a rival faction. You have to ask him why he's doing that.
But we'll get him on at some point, perhaps. we'll get off him for now then. Okay, so you say that according to, in your recent book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, you say that according to Anglo-American conservatism, religion is, quote, essential to the national heritage and indispensable for justice and public morals. You then add that the state should also offer, quote, toleration to religious and social views that do not endanger the integrity and well-being of the nation as a whole. That strikes me as giving quite a lot of leeway to people who might wish to persecute on religious grounds. So I guess the question is, what do you mean by endanger, and what do you mean by the integrity and well-being of the nation?
Look, this is the virtue of nationalism is not a utopia. It's intended to be an accurate to offer an accurate description of what human beings are actually like, and to try to offer a direction that might, in general, improve things, to allow greater national freedom, and as a consequence, the greater expression of different peoples by different peoples of their own traditions and their own worldviews. And the book is been out already for since.
Can I just clarify there? Sorry, I was quoting there. If I didn't make that clear, I was quoting from Conservatism, a Rediscovery.
No, it's the same. It's the same theory. I didn't. Okay. I'm sorry. I was not trying to recant the theory. But again, to be clear, when you're reading me on nationalism, you're not reading a utopia. You're not reading like a liberal or a Marxist view that says if everyone in the world did this, there would be peace and prosperity. I don't believe such things. I'm much too realistic for that. And so the aim when I talk about nationalism is to try in general to create a greater degree of freedom for as many nations as possible, which I think becomes impossible when you submit the world to the rule of a single imperial power. And it's already impossible in Europe. The EU has barely begun its efforts to become a serious imperial power, and already it persecutes and abuses whatever nations think something or do something that's different from what the center in Brussels wants them to do. So I don't think there's any question that if you take my nationalist principle and you apply it all over the world, and you allow all sorts of nations their own right to rule themselves, if you do that, so they're not going to be the same. They're going to be different from one another. And some of them are going to look very good to us, and maybe we can even learn from them. And others are going to look terrible to us, and we're even going to think that they're evil. But that's not an argument against nationalism. That's an argument against human nature, because human nature is such that human beings are sometimes good and they're often evil. And my argument is not that all nationalism is good. On the contrary, it's not. My argument is simply that nationalism is a better system for thinking about world politics than imperialism.
Indeed. But on the point about, because you say that elevating religion to the public sphere, to a privileged position in the public sphere is an important thing to do, yet you also say that toleration for religious and social views that diverge from that norm should be tolerated. I suppose the question is, in your own personal judgment, how does a nation state prevent that, the importance of elevating religion to that critical role, from descending into theocratic intolerance? Like, what is the line in your judgment?
Look again, the conservative will tend to say, most conservatives I know say things like, believe things like, religion is also a fact. It is a given of human social nature. We do not know of any cohesive nations. In fact, we don't know of any cohesive loyalty groups at any scale: family, tribe, nation, family of nations, we don't know of any such cohesive loyalty groups that do not have some kind of public religion or public philosophy by which they recognize themselves and describe sort of in the broadest outline what their worldview is. All nations have this. All empires have this. There's simply no exceptions. And so the question is not, is there going to be a public religion, but what is going to be the public religion? And in today in the UK, as in America, the woke neo-Marxists are making an astonishingly successful bid to bring the entire sphere, public sphere, under their thumb and to establish woke neo-Marxism as the new public religion, replacing the old Enlightenment liberalism. And in my book, I argue that neither of these are good solutions, and that places that still have where there still is a Christian majority, or at least a pro-Christian majority, should fight the advance of this woke tidal wave with the strongest thing that they've got, which is Christianity or biblical religion.
Which is why you were quite encouraged, weren't you, recently about the Supreme Court decisions which lifted some of the bans on the involvement of the Bible in public education. You view that as a step forward for conservatism in the US.
It's a step forward, but I think a real step forward would be to overrule the 1947 Everson decision of the US Supreme Court, which was the first time in American history in which religion was explicitly declared to be something that could not be involved with the operating of the state. And that was an immensely damaging and harmful judicial theory, without basis in American history or the American Constitution, certainly without basis in British history. Yes. And we don't have any choice but to, at this point, to say that that was simply a mistake and to overturn it.
While we're on America, we'll stay there. You argue in the book Conservatism: A Rediscovery that Federalists such as George Washington and John Adams, who called for a strong central government, are, quote, a model for nationalist conservatives in America and other countries today. But rather than seeking federal solutions to the culture war, is it not more realistic for us to trust that red states will shame blue states by their superior example? Observers are already describing the exodus of people from places like New York and California to Tennessee and Florida as the big sort. Is that a promising development in your view, or is more federal involvement necessary?
Okay, look, we are, if we use the word federal the way you're using it, it's a completely legitimate usage. The problem is we'll get very tangled up in the historical accident that the American Nationalist Conservative Party called itself the Federalists. And the reason for that is because before the Constitution of 1787, Federalist meant somebody who wanted to give power to the states and to not have a central government. And by adopting the word Federalist instead of the word nationalist, the Nationalist Party became the Federalist Party. So that was advantageous to them rhetorically, but it's been disadvantageous for clear thinking ever since. So look, what I'm proposing is that American nationalism and British nationalism and conservatism should reestablish a public culture that is Christian and biblical to the extent that this is possible in those places where there is a majority. I do not believe it makes sense for a country, a nation that has a small minority at this point of believing Christians try to impose their Christianity by force on many millions of people who don't want it. I think that's going to backfire. It's not a prudent way to advance a conservative agenda. I think the conservative agenda has to be to allow regions and states that want to experiment with a Christian public culture as an alternative to what we clearly see is coming, which will destroy us. That should be allowed. It should be allowed in America, and it should be allowed in Britain, and it should be allowed elsewhere.
So it sounds like you are encouraged then by the big sort, which is interesting. Just more specifically then, because I'm not as familiar with the Federalist Party as I'd like to be, and it was very interesting reading the chapter you have on them in your book. What in particular do you think nationalist conservatives around the world need to learn from the likes of Washington, Adams, Governor Morris, Alexander Hamilton? What is it that we should learn from them?
The first point is that like the English nationalists that we were speaking about,
yes,
in the 1500s and 1600s, the American Federalist Party was a nationalist party that in fact sought to restore the much of the English Constitution to prevent the 13 colonies from descending into chaos. The situation was 1776. The Americans declare independence, and what they declared was 13 independent sovereign states.
Yes.
And those 13 independent states attempting to fight a war and conduct diplomacy discovered very quickly that they were unable to raise the necessary troops. They were unable to impose taxes sufficient to the effort. When eventually peace was being negotiated with Britain, the Americans were even unable to impose the provisions.
Yeah.
But yeah, the provisions of the Treaty of Paris, they couldn't impose them because they weren't in control of these 13 independent states. Yeah. Already during the war itself, very early on, American leadership like Washington and many of his officers, Knox and John Jay and others, came to the conclusion that actually the British government was the best model, and that what America needed was a restoration of the British Constitution adapted to local conditions. I mean, the Americans never had, there was never a king ruling directly, physically in person himself in America, and Americans never had a local nobility. So, it had to be a somewhat different constitution based on American traditions. But the principal move of Washington and his party was to reinstate the unitary national executive, to create a bicameral national legislature modeled on the Lords and the House of Lords and the House of Commons, to give the power of taxation and legislation to the Congress, again modeled on Parliament, and you can just keep going. It was a modified version of the British Constitution. And the American Federalists saw this as the key to creating a strong, cohesive, independent American nation in the image of England, whereas their opponents in the Democratic Republican Party detested England, and their ideas were essentially French, and they did a lot of harm.
Yes, yeah. And you're talking about people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine there.
Yes.
Yes. This is maybe just an observation, an ironic observation. I don't know how much substance it has, but how would you reconcile your belief in nationalism with the fact that the Anglo-American conservatism, which you celebrate in your brilliant new book, would only prevail over a single rain-sodden island in the North Sea, that is to say my own country, if it was not for the British Empire?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well,
are you saying, look at all the good the British Empire did for India?
and not for India as such, but the Anglo-American conservatism that you describe, the reason why it enjoys preeminence in the world, particularly in the form of the United States, was because its traditions were carried
Right.
across the world by an empire.
Yeah. Well, look, it's a good question, and answering it, requires us to think about all sorts of counterfactuals, which is very difficult, very difficult to do. I think that, I mean, I've said this many times, that I think that it's possible, just as it's possible for an independent national state to do evil, or even great evil. It's also possible for a great imperial power to do good things. I don't, I'm not one of these people who's looking to find all the evil that the British Empire ever did.
Yeah.
But the question that I think we need to ask ourselves, certainly the British Empire brought all sorts of things to many places in the world that would not have gotten them anywhere near as quickly if there had not been a British Empire. Does that mean that that those things would never have been adopted? It's not entirely clear. In Burke's writings, you find him praising the Polish people for amending their dysfunctional traditional constitution to make it more like the British Constitution. And in general, Anglo-American conservatives have such a view that you need to be focused on conserving your own traditions and your own ways, but in cases where there is no choice and a repair has to be made, and then the question is, do you just make it up out of whole cloth, or do you borrow it from a neighboring people? And the English knew all sorts of such things. The what we today call the capitalist system, the stock market, was pioneered by the Dutch,
yes,
and adopted by the English, because they saw that it made the Dutch more capable of warfare, because they could more easily raise monies for wars, or for commerce, or for other kinds of enterprises that could strengthen the country. By the same token, the English mercantile law is part of the common law, but it was adopted from the Dutch and the Italians, who had experience with capitalist style contracts, insurance companies, all sorts of things that England didn't know much about. And it did work to strengthen England, but just as a cautionary note, the institution of slavery was brought to England by this mercantile law. The English didn't have slaves before they incorporated mercantile law into the common law. And ultimately, what was required was for the common law courts to reject the aspect of the mercantile law which allowed for people to be slaves in England as incompatible with traditional English law.
Yes.
So this kind of a theory allows for experimenting with things that work in other countries where it's necessary for your defense, for strengthening you, for your improvement. But you also, as a conservative, you need to understand that that sometimes you try something and it fails.
Yes.
The American experiment with nationwide, nationally imposed mandatory abortion laws, that liberal abortion laws, was a failure in the United States. The American people were not ever able to reconcile themselves to it, and it failed, and they had to go back, and that's also an important conservative principle.
Interesting. Okay. You argue that the liberal policy of free trade, particularly towards China in recent years, has been blind, quote, to the bonds of mutual loyalty that bind nations and tribes together. But a personal question about your own political judgment. Provided there are no national security concerns involved in a trading relationship, do you generally support the need for free trade between allies, or are there other considerations that need to be taken into account?
Look, it's a very I think it's a complicated question, because there are conditions in which free trade is strongly benefits both parties. And my inclination is to suspect that that's generally true in cases of nations that are friendly with one another. So I tend towards that side of the argument. On the other hand, there's a serious question about whether free trade is not actually more the result of successful national independence and industrialization than the cause of it.
Yeah.
Because this is an argument. I'm not sufficiently well versed in the economic history to take to tell you here I'm absolutely sure about this, but it does appear that America, when it was strengthening itself and becoming a world power, that it was very selective about what kind of free trade there was. And the same thing's true for England. I mean, what is called mercantilism,
yes,
that's basically one of these words that's been turned into some kind of evil. But basically, what mercantilism means is that you try to do what's best for your nation, and in particular, the building up of industrial capacity and is something that dramatically increases your ability to not just your wealth, but your ability to defend your country. And so the Federalists were not free traders.
No.
I mean, the Federalist policy, later the Whig policy, after that the Republican policy of Lincoln and his party, was careful to make sure that anything that had to do with the unity of the nation, its ability to wage war, was not treated as something that simply everybody should just do whatever they want. It was rather something that government had to think about.
Indeed, and Donald Trump, of course, tapped into some of the grievances that result from a dogmatic loyalty to free market fundamentals on the point of free trade. So that's interesting. That I didn't realize that had the honorable history that you were describing, like the Federalists taking that view, Lincoln taking that view as well. Two more questions, Yoram. One of the most interesting points in the book for me was when you wrote movingly about the West's post-war decline from the traditional family, which you celebrate, to the nuclear family, which you regard as much weaker, but which I instinctively have always thought of as being the goal, is that we should want to encourage nuclear families. I think a lot of conservatives think prima facie that nuclear families are the way to go. First, could you please explain the difference between the nuclear family and the traditional family? And second, is it possible for our highly advanced economies to revive the traditional family, or does it belong in a lost, irrecoverable agrarian past?
Well, I don't actually know what is possible. I don't have a crystal ball. I know I think I know which direction we should go. The issue of the family is before you even get to the national implications of the destruction of the family, you need to look at the impact on individuals. The family first and foremost impacts those individuals who participate, and I think it's fair to ask whether the image of the family that was sold in the 1950s, where there's a man and a woman are married, and then they have 2 or 3 children living in a kind of a detached suburban home, and every day the children are put on buses or trains or airplanes or whatever and sent to school, and the father is sent out of the house to go to a job that, where the children never see him, and the mother never sees him, and then the mother is left at home to try to, I mean, it's just absurd, the term homemaker, to try to make a home with no people in it. And when we think about the traditional family, whether it was agrarian or whether it was a family that dealt in some other small business, in a light manufacture or in commerce, and the old theory of the family was based on a different model. That model was, to begin with, that there is a lifelong relationship between the husband and the wife, and it's not just during the time that their children are under 18. And in addition, the principle that children have a lifelong relationship and obligation to their parents, so that they don't move away when they're 18 and then never see them again, as we do today, mostly, but rather they stay in proximity with their to their family. Maybe not every single person in the world, but in general, you stay in proximity because you owe your parents things. And when your parents get old, they need to be taken care of, not dumped in an asylum of some kind, right? So, and the last point I would make about this traditional family is that it's a business enterprise. The traditional family, it's not that the father goes out to work and then later the mother goes out to work and then the home stands empty. The traditional family is a business enterprise, and the mother and the father work together, and the children help. And all you need to do is read the 31st chapter of the book of Proverbs, the husband praising his wife. Look at all the commercial activity that's involved, that she's directly responsible for. The wife who sat home in that empty house in the 1950s and 1960s and started going crazy, and then writing books saying that the nuclear family is a tomb for women. That's not entirely untrue. It was a different world when children could grow up helping their parents with the family business. That gives them much more respect for their parents and ability to learn from their parents. They feel responsible to their parents in a way that children who spend all their time in school usually do not. And so I do think that there's a great deal that's been lost, and that's even before you get into questions of the role of grandparents in raising children, the role of aunts and uncles in raising children, the role of the extended traditional family within the local congregation. All of these aspects have been wiped out and replaced with a false ideal that hurts people. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do there as conservatives.
Interesting. Okay. Now, lastly, in relation to the decline of traditional religion in the West, you write that whatever government does not honor is weakened by this neglect. It goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, but why is it not feasible, in your view, in the way that philosophers like John Stuart Mill have argued, for government to continue treating religion as purely a private matter in the way that liberalism insists it to be? Why is it so essential that it is honored from on high, as it were?
Well, we try. First of all, we tried it. I mean, the attempt to create Enlightenment liberal governments in America and Britain and throughout the West after the Second World War, that attempt has failed. I mean, it's not that we didn't do the experiment. We did the experiment in real time on dozens of countries, and what we found is that the original claim that you could privatize religion and separate church from state and have everything turn out okay is utterly false. It took 2 generations from the time that the Americans banned Bible and God and prayer from the school system to the point where people are seriously with. I mean, this is not a joke. They're having trouble distinguishing between a man and a woman. They're having trouble distinguishing between what's owed to a member of your nation and a citizen on the one hand, and people from the other side of the world who are claiming the right to move into your country. It's absolutely clear that as long as there was a Christian and Jewish, a biblical basis for the way that nations thought about things, and it was reinforced publicly, and everyone understood that, all right, maybe there's some people who dissent, maybe there's some people who don't agree with the way it's done publicly. So then then you get into the question of how much toleration can you afford to give to different kinds of dissent, and that's also something that can be experimented with. But as a general matter, removing Christianity from the lives of most individuals, from their public lives, had the effect of making it embarrassing and strange to try to bring any of that traditionalism out of the home. And as soon as it was embarrassing and strange everywhere you went, to be any kind of traditionalist, because Enlightenment liberalism was the official new religion, then it started to die in the homes as well. I mean, it's just absolutely not true that most parents have the capacity to withstand the pressure of a public ideology that's destroying their personal beliefs.
Yoram Hazony, author of Conservatism, A Rediscovery, thank you very much for joining me on the Eurocon podcast.
Thank you for having me. God bless you.